He almost didn't go. And if he hadn't, his life would have remained exactly what it had become, a locked room with no windows and no reason to find the key. Ethan Brooks wasn't searching for love. He wasn't searching for hope. He was simply trying to survive one evening without feeling like he was slowly disappearing from the inside out. But life doesn't ask permission. Across a reception lawn glowing with golden string lights, a woman turned and looked directly at him. And something that had been buried for 4 years shifted without warning. This is the story of a man who learned that second chances don't knock. They simply appear quiet and unexpected in the middle of a wedding he never wanted to attend. If this story speaks to you, stay until the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The invitation had been sitting on Ethan's kitchen counter for 3 weeks. He'd moved it twice, once to make room for Mason's cereal bowl, once because looking at it made his chest do something uncomfortable. It wasn't a bad invitation. His sister Claire had chosen thick cream cardstock with gold lettering, the kind of stationery that costs more per sheet than Ethan spent on lunch. The venue was Cedar Lake Lodge, 40 minutes north of town, where the water caught the last of the evening light and turned it into something that belonged on a postcard. It should have been simple. His little sister was getting married. He was supposed to be happy. He was happy for her. Mostly. It was everything else that came with it. The other guests, the dancing, the way people at weddings looked at a man who arrived alone. That made him want to call Claire the morning of and tell her Mason had a fever. Mason did not have a fever. Mason was, in fact, sitting at the kitchen table eating toast with an enthusiasm that suggested he had never felt better in his 8 years of life. "Dad." Mason didn't look up from his toast. "You're doing the thing again." "What thing?" "The thing where you stare at something and your face looks like you're doing math." Ethan looked at his son. The kid had his mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that always seemed to be paying closer attention than anyone else in the room. It was unsettling sometimes, how much Mason noticed. "I'm not doing math," Ethan said. "You're nervous about the wedding." "I'm not nervous about the wedding." Mason took a bite of toast, chewed slowly. "Okay." He said it the way kids say okay when they absolutely do not believe you but have decided to let it go. Ethan had learned that tone over the past 4 years. It was the tone Mason used when he was being careful with him. 8 years old, and the kid was already being careful with him. That landed somewhere uncomfortable in Ethan's chest, the way it always did. He turned back to the coffee maker and poured his second cup, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard. The lawn needed mowing again. There was a plastic soccer ball sitting near the fence that had been there since Tuesday. The garden bed along the back wall, the one that Sarah had planted the spring before she got sick, had given up being a garden bed and was now mostly weeds and one stubborn rosebush that refused to die no matter how little attention Ethan paid it. He thought about that rosebush more than was probably reasonable. "We're going to be late," Mason said. "We have 40 minutes. "You said we'd leave at 11. "It's 11:04. "Dad." Ethan turned around. Mason had finished his toast, put his plate in the sink without being asked. Another thing he'd started doing without being asked. Another thing that made Ethan feel simultaneously proud and gutted. And was standing in his dress shirt and khakis looking like a small person who had his life significantly more together than his father did. "All right," Ethan said. "Get your jacket." The drive up to Cedar Lake was the kind of drive that reminded you there were parts of the world that hadn't been ruined yet. The highway gave way to 2-lane roads that wound through pine trees so thick the afternoon light came through in broken pieces. Mason sat in the passenger seat with his window down 2 inches despite Ethan's suggestion that it was too cold, watching the trees go by with the focused attention he gave to most things he found interesting. "Do you think Aunt Claire is nervous?" Mason asked, somewhere around mile 20. "Probably," Ethan said. "Most people are nervous before they get married." "Were you nervous?" The question was simple and direct, the way Mason's questions always were. He didn't ask them to be difficult. He asked them because he wanted to know, and he had not yet developed the social awareness that told most adults which questions to leave unasked. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, a little. But you did it anyway." "Yeah, because you loved Mom." "Because I loved your mom." Mason considered this. He did that, actually sat with things before responding, turned them over in his mind. Teachers had mentioned it during parent conferences, always framing it as a positive, though Ethan suspected it sometimes drove other kids his age slightly crazy. "I think Aunt Claire loves James," Mason said finally. "I think she does too." "Good." Mason leaned back in his seat. "That's the important part." Ethan glanced at his son and said nothing. 8 years old. The kid was 8 years old. He turned his attention back to the road and drove. Cedar Lake Lodge was exactly the kind of venue that made Ethan feel like he had arrived from a different planet. Not because it was over the top, it wasn't. Claire had good taste and a realistic budget, and James, her fiancé, was a steady, unshowy kind of man who Ethan had liked from the first time they'd met. But the venue was beautiful in the way things are beautiful when you are not in the right state of mind to appreciate beauty without it making you aware of everything you no longer have. The ceremony was held on a wide cedar platform that extended slightly over the lake. White chairs arranged in rows. Simple floral arrangements, cream and pale green, no fuss. String lights not yet lit, because the sun was still up, but strung between the posts ready for later. A small string quartet tuned near the side. People milled around in their good clothes, talking and laughing in that way people talk and laugh when they are genuinely pleased to be somewhere. Ethan stood just inside the entrance with Mason beside him and took stock of what he was dealing with. There were approximately 60 guests. He recognized maybe a third of them, family, old friends of Claire's, a few faces from the neighborhood. The rest were strangers. Everyone, without exception, appeared to have arrived with someone. He felt it immediately. That thing he'd felt at every social gathering since Sarah died, a low, persistent awareness of his own separateness, like being slightly outside the frame of a photograph. "There's Grandma," Mason said, and immediately started moving. His mother was standing near the chairs with his Aunt Donna, and the moment she spotted Mason, she opened her arms, and the kid walked straight into a hug like he was 6 again. Ethan watched it and felt something loosen slightly in his chest. Whatever else was difficult about today, Mason would be fine. "Ethan!" His mother reached out and squeezed his arm after releasing Mason. She was a small woman who had always seemed larger than her actual size, and she looked at him with the careful attention she'd been giving him for 4 years. "You look good." "Thanks, Mom." "You sleep?" "Enough." She didn't push it. She'd learned when to push and when to let it go. It had taken them both a while to find that balance. The first year after Sarah died, there had been weeks when his mother called every single day, and Ethan had felt simultaneously grateful and suffocated. They'd figured it out eventually. "Claire's in the lodge," his mother said. "She's been asking about you." "I'll go find her. She's nervous." Mason called it. His mother looked at his son with unmistakable delight. Of course he did. Claire was in a small room near the back of the lodge that someone had designated the bridal suite, which mostly meant it had better lighting than the storage room next door, and someone had put a small bouquet of flowers on the dresser. She was standing in front of the mirror in her wedding dress, a simple, elegant thing in ivory that suited her completely. And when Ethan knocked and pushed the door open, she turned around and her expression cycled through about 4 emotions in 2 seconds. "You came," she said. "Obviously I came." "You almost didn't. I was never—" He stopped. She was giving him the look, the one she'd been giving him since they were kids, the one that said she knew exactly what he was thinking and would like him to stop pretending otherwise. "Okay, I thought about it. I knew it." She didn't sound angry. She sounded like Claire, slightly exasperated, deeply fond. "Come here." He crossed the room and she hugged him, carefully, minding the dress. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn since she was 17, something warm and slightly floral. His little sister. He could still remember the exact way she'd looked at age 5, standing in their mother's kitchen demanding to be allowed to make pancakes by herself. "I'm glad you're here," she said against his shoulder. "Me too," he said. And surprisingly, in that moment, he meant it. She pulled back and looked at him. Claire was 28. She had their father's dark hair and their mother's sharp eyes, and she had been worrying about Ethan for 4 years with a particular kind of sister worry that he'd spent most of that time trying to deflect. "You look tired," she said. Mom already told me I looked good. Mom was being nice. You look tired and you need a haircut. Thank you, Claire. I'm saying it with love. I know you are. She straightened his tie to him. He'd put on a tie, which already felt like a minor victory, and stepped back to look at him properly. James has a friend here, David. He's a teacher, just moved to town, doesn't know many people yet. I was going to ask James to introduce you, but I'm fine. I'm not trying to... Claire, he said it gently. It's your wedding day. Stop worrying about me. She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and let it go. You look beautiful, he told her, because she did. She rolled her eyes but smiled. Go find a seat before the good ones are taken. The ceremony itself was short and honest and exactly right. James, a straightforward man with an open face and the kind of steady calm that Ethan had always respected, said his vows like he'd thought about every word and meant all of them. Claire cried during hers, laughed at herself for crying, then finished them with the kind of clear-eyed certainty that made the whole crowd go quiet for a moment. Ethan sat in the third row with Mason beside him and watched his sister get married. He felt proud. He felt happy for her. He also felt, underneath all of that, quiet and persistent, a particular kind of ache that he'd stopped trying to name. It wasn't jealousy. He didn't want what James had in the sense of wanting it from someone else. It was more like standing outside a warm room and looking through the window. You're not angry, you're outside. You just remember what it felt like to be in. Mason reached over during the vows and, without looking at him, put his hand over Ethan's on the armrest. Ethan looked down at his son's small hand covering his. The kid was staring straight ahead at the ceremony, expression composed, like he hadn't done anything in particular. Ethan turned back to the front and didn't say anything either. The reception shifted to the lawn and the lodge's wide back terrace as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. Someone hit a switch, and the string lights came on all at once, hundreds of them strung between wooden posts and through the branches of the lakeside oaks, and the whole space transformed. The lawn, which had looked pleasant in the daylight, looked like something different in that golden light, like a version of the evening that had been designed to make people feel things. Ethan stood near the edge of the crowd with a glass of something cold and watched it. He'd done his duty. He'd hugged the bride, shaken the groom's hand, accepted compliments about how big Mason had gotten from approximately 7 different relatives, and navigated 2 conversations about his job. He did structural engineering for a mid-size firm downtown, work he was good at and found genuinely interesting, which was more than a lot of people could say. Without the conversations going anywhere, he didn't want them to go. He was calculating how much longer he needed to stay. Another hour, maybe. Wait until the first dance, congratulate Claire one more time, make sure Mason wasn't in the middle of something with his cousins, and then quietly extract himself and drive home. It was a solid plan. He was so occupied with it that he almost missed her. Almost. She was standing at the edge of the reception, slightly apart from the nearest group of guests, holding a glass of white wine and looking at the lake. She was wearing a dark green dress, not formal enough to be overdressed, not casual enough to look like she hadn't made an effort, and her dark hair was up in a way that seemed like it had been put there without much fuss. She wasn't looking at anyone. She was just looking at the water, and there was something in her posture that was not sad exactly, more like someone who was comfortable being quiet in a noisy place. He knew her. That was the strange part. He actually knew her, or knew of her, anyway. Victoria Bennett had moved into the house 3 doors down from his about 7 months ago. He'd seen her a handful of times, getting into her car in the morning, checking her mail, once having what looked like an intense phone conversation on her front porch. He'd waved a couple of times. She'd waved back. That was the full extent of it. He wasn't sure why she was here, probably a friend of Claire's or James's that he didn't know, and he almost looked away, almost went back to his drink and his exit planning. But then she turned. She didn't turn because she sensed him looking, or for any cinematic reason. She just turned, the way people turn at receptions because there's always something to look at. And her eyes landed on him, and instead of the polite nod of recognition he expected, she paused. Then she smiled. Not a polite smile. Something warmer than that. And she raised her glass slightly in his direction and nodded toward the empty space beside her. an invitation. Ethan stood there for approximately 3 seconds, holding his drink, thinking about his plan to leave quietly within the hour. Then he walked over. 3 doors down, she said when he was close enough. I almost didn't recognize you without the perpetually frozen lawn. He surprised himself by laughing. Actually, laughing. I've been meaning to deal with that. It's been 7 months. I know. She was looking at him with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite sympathy. Something somewhere in between, observational and warm at the same time. Up close she was more, present somehow. More there than she'd seemed from a distance. Victoria, she said, and extended the hand not holding the wine glass. Ethan, I know. I've seen you do the school run on Thursday mornings. She said it without any self-consciousness, just matter of fact. Your son always looks like he's arguing with you about something. He argues about the radio station. Who wins? He thinks he does. She smiled at that, looking back out toward the lake. The sun was getting low. The light was that specific deep gold that only happens for about 20 minutes in the late evening, and the water was catching it and throwing it back. How do you know Claire and James? Ethan asked. James, we worked on a project together 2 years ago. His firm did some development consultation for my company. She glanced at him. You're the brother. The brother, yeah. She talks about you. Something about that made him slightly wary. Good things, I hope. Victoria tilted her head, not quite committing to an answer, and he found himself laughing again. That's not reassuring, he said. She loves you very much, Victoria said. That came through clearly. The rest was... She paused, seemed to choose her words. Context. That's a diplomatic way to put it. I'm a CEO. Diplomatic is a job requirement. He looked at her. He'd heard that through the neighborhood, something about a tech company, regional, growing fast. He hadn't paid close attention because it wasn't relevant to anything in his life, and his life had not had much space for things that weren't directly relevant. What does your company do? Supply chain software. Sounds boring, I know. It doesn't sound boring. Most people's eyes glaze over at supply chain. I'm a structural engineer. I lose people at load-bearing calculations. We can be boring together. She laughed at that. A real laugh, not a polite one. And something about the sound of it made the string lights and the lake and the golden hour light suddenly feel less like a backdrop for someone else's happiness and more like just a place. A good place to be standing. Fair enough, she said. Supply chain software. I started the company 6 years ago. We're based downtown. We have about 200 employees now. She said it cleanly, without apology or excessive modesty. She was proud of it, and comfortable being proud. That's not a small thing, Ethan said. No, she agreed. It's not. They talked for longer than Ethan intended. It started with easy things. The wedding, the venue, the way the lodge looked like it had been specifically designed for this kind of evening. Victoria mentioned she'd been to a wedding here 2 years ago, and the food had been significantly worse, which led to a conversation about catering choices at events, which led somehow to an argument about whether open bars were a net positive or negative for social dynamics at weddings. Positive, Ethan said. You're only saying that because you've been nursing that drink for 40 minutes. He looked at his glass. She was right. He'd barely touched it. The problem with open bars, Victoria said, is that by hour 3, someone always has a conversation they were never supposed to have, and then Monday morning is very complicated for everyone involved. Or by hour 3, people have loosened up enough to actually enjoy themselves. Or both. Or both, he conceded. I notice you're not loosened up, she said. Not accusatory. Observational. He considered deflecting. No, I'm not really a... He stopped, started differently. I'm usually looking for the exit at these things. But not yet. He looked at her. Not yet. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression, a recognition, maybe, like she understood exactly what he meant without requiring explanation. I'm usually looking for it too, she said quietly. You seem comfortable. I've had practice appearing comfortable. She took a sip of her wine. It's different. He understood that. He understood it in the particular way you understand things that other people have told you about, but you've had to actually live to fully comprehend. Your husband? He asked. He wasn't sure what made him ask it. Something about the way she'd said it. She didn't flinch. Marcus, 3 years ago. She paused. Cardiac. He was 34. I'm sorry. I am too. She said it simply, without performing grief or suppressing it. Just accurate. Your wife? Sarah, 4 years, cancer. He heard how that sounded. Reductive, insufficient. And he almost said something to fill the space, but she didn't look like she needed him to. She just nodded once. So you know, she said. Yeah. The thing where you arrive at something like this and it's like watching through glass. She looked at him. Exactly like that. They stood quietly for a moment. The string light swayed slightly in the lake breeze. From somewhere behind them, a group of guests broke into laughter at something. Mason is your son, she said. 8 years old, going on 45. She smiled. I've seen him out front sometimes. He seems serious. He's the most serious child I have ever encountered in my life, and I say that as someone who was a serious child. Was Marcus funny? The question surprised him. Its directness, and that she'd switched back to her husband so naturally. Was Sarah funny? He asked instead. Victoria considered. In a dry way, she'd say something completely deadpan and you wouldn't realize it was a joke until 3 minutes later. Ethan felt something tighten briefly in his chest. Sarah had a loud laugh, like genuinely loud, embarrassingly loud at movies. Mason got her laugh. Victoria's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, something more careful than that. That's a good thing to carry forward. It is, he said. And for the first time in a long time, saying so didn't feel like it was costing him something. The dancing started at dusk. A DJ set up on the lodge's back terrace, and James and Claire took the small cleared space by the lake for their first dance. Ethan watched from where he was standing. He and Victoria had drifted slightly closer to the water over the past hour, away from the main crowd, and he felt the familiar ache start to return. But then he looked sideways at Victoria. She was watching the couple on the makeshift dance floor, and her expression was doing something complicated. The same mixture of happiness for someone else and an awareness of your own losses that Ethan recognized completely. Her jaw was set just slightly. Her wine glass was held a little too still. She felt him looking and glanced over. For a second, they just looked at each other. And it was the kind of moment that doesn't happen very often, where two people realize simultaneously that they are looking at each other from the same side of something. It doesn't get easier exactly, Victoria said. No. It gets, she seemed to search for it, different. The shape of it changes. Ethan nodded slowly. Mason asked me on the drive up here if I'd been nervous before I got married. He paused. He's never asked me anything like that before. What did you say? I said yes, that I did it anyway because I loved his mom. Victoria was quiet. He's been careful with me, Ethan said, since Sarah. He watches what he says, what he asks. He's 8 years old and he's been managing his own grief and mine simultaneously, and He stopped. He hadn't meant to say that much. It was more than he usually said to people he'd known for years. He realized it had been approximately 90 minutes since they started talking. Sorry, he said. That was, don't apologize. She said it firmly. Not harsh, just clear. You don't have to apologize for that. He exhaled. I don't usually, say things to people? He laughed despite himself. Yeah. I do the same thing, she said. It's easier to keep things compartmentalized. Work, home, Mason, and everything else in a box. She glanced at him. The box gets very full. The box gets very full, he agreed. The first dance ended. The DJ transitioned into something upbeat, and the dance floor immediately populated with people who had been waiting for the invitation. Ethan looked for Mason and found him near the edge of the crowd with his cousin Lily, who was 10, apparently explaining something to her with considerable animation. Your son is a natural lecturer, Victoria said, following his gaze. He gets that from... Ethan started and then stopped, because what he'd been about to say was, he gets that from me, which would have been true, but he realized he'd also been about to say he gets that from his mother, and both things were true in different ways, and somehow Victoria had made the space large enough to hold that. Both, he finished. She smiled and said nothing. An hour later, Ethan realized he had stopped looking for the exit. He hadn't been tracking the time. He hadn't been counting down to a reasonable departure. He had been standing beside a woman he barely knew, talking about things he didn't talk about, and he had been present, actually there, not managing the evening from a slight internal distance. It was disorienting. Mason found him around 8:30, arriving at Ethan's side with the slightly worn energy of a kid who had been in social situations for several hours and was approaching his limit. He looked up at Victoria without self-consciousness. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Victoria said. "You live on our street." "I do, 3 houses down." Mason considered her. "I've seen you on the phone on your porch." Guilty. "You look like you're usually annoyed at whoever you're talking to." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, but Victoria laughed, surprised and genuine. "That's probably accurate. It's usually a conference call." "What's a conference call?" "A phone call where there are too many people and only 2 of them needed to be there." Mason seemed to find this entirely satisfying as an explanation. He looked at his father. "Dad, Lily said her mom said we can see the fireworks from across the lake in like 20 minutes. Then we should stay for that." Mason nodded, apparently concluding this was reasonable, and without ceremony went back to his cousin. Ethan watched him go and then turned to find Victoria watching him with something warm in her expression. "He's something," she said. "He really is." "You've done a good job." He started to deflect. He did it automatically, had been doing it for 4 years when anyone said anything like that, and then stopped. "He makes it not that hard," he said instead, which was the truer answer. The fireworks were visible from a dock that extended out over the lake, and a loose group of guests drifted down to watch. Ethan and Victoria ended up near the end of the dock, standing a few feet apart, Mason pressed against the railing between them. The show wasn't elaborate. It was a local fireworks display from somewhere across the lake, not anything put on for the wedding, but the lake threw back the reflections and doubled everything. Green and gold and white burst above the tree line and scattered into the water below, and for a few minutes nobody talked. Ethan stood in the cooling air and watched the light dissolve over the lake. He was not thinking about leaving. He was not thinking about Sarah, exactly, though she was always there, somewhere behind everything, the way things are that become part of the architecture of who you are. He was not thinking about the frozen lawn he should have dealt with months ago, or the school run on Thursday, or the report he had due at work by the end of the week. He was standing on a dock in the evening, watching fireworks reflect in a lake, and his son was beside him pointing at each burst and naming the colors with complete seriousness. And 3 doors down lived a woman who understood exactly what it meant to watch life through glass, and was, apparently, figuring out the same thing he was, that the glass doesn't have to be permanent. Mason looked up at him. "Dad, are you doing the math thing?" "No," Ethan said. "I'm not doing anything." His son looked at him for a moment with those careful, attentive eyes. Then he looked back at the fireworks. "Good," he said. The words settled over the water and disappeared. By the time Ethan found Claire to say goodnight, it was past 9:30. She looked at him, flushed from dancing, happier than he'd seen her in years, James beside her with his arm around her waist. And something shifted in her expression when she clocked his face. "You're in a better mood than I expected," she said. "I told you I'd be fine." "You told me you'd stay an hour." He had told her that, in the text he'd sent 2 days ago. "I'll come, I'll stay an hour, please don't set me up with anyone." "Plans change." Claire glanced past him, and he turned to find Victoria behind him, arriving to say her own goodbyes. His sister's expression was something he was going to have to discuss with her later, and was not going to be a short conversation. "Victoria," Claire said warmly and with far too much brightness, "you two found each other." "We're neighbors," Victoria said mildly, and either she didn't notice the subtext in Claire's voice, or she was very good at ignoring it. "Neighbors," Claire repeated. She looked at Ethan. He looked back at her with an expression that he hoped communicated, "Say nothing. I mean it. I will walk out of this reception right now. Don't test me, Claire, I swear. Well, Claire said after a moment, with the restraint of someone exerting genuine effort. It was wonderful to see you both. She hugged Victoria. She hugged Ethan, and her mouth was right next to his ear, and he felt her take a breath. Don't, he said quietly. She laughed and let him go. James shook his hand with the uncomplicated good nature of a man who had not noticed any of the above, and Ethan liked him all the more for it. In the parking lot, they walked to their cars, more or less in the same direction, because that was what happened when you lived 3 houses from each other. The lot was partially lit, quiet now. Most guests were still inside. Mason walked ahead of them, pointing his small flashlight at the gravel with great dedication. Thank you, Ethan said. Victoria glanced at him. For? He thought about how to say it. For not letting me stand there alone looking for the exit all night. She was quiet for a step or two. You weren't alone, she said. That's sort of the thing. He looked at her. She looked back, and there was something in her expression that was not an invitation exactly, but was not a door closing either. It was just honest. The way the whole evening had been honest. Drive safe, she said, and continued toward her car. Ethan stood there for a moment in the parking lot of Cedar Lake Lodge, watching his son lightsaber his flashlight beam across the gravel, hearing the faint music still drifting from the back of the lodge. He hadn't been ready to come tonight. He was still not sure he was ready for whatever tonight had quietly, without announcement, begun. But standing in the dark with the sound of his son's footsteps on the gravel and the smell of lake air and pine, he realized that for the first time in 4 years, the question of ready felt less like a wall and more like a threshold. He didn't know what was on the other side. He just knew, in the quiet way that honest things arrive, that he wasn't afraid to find out. Mason climbed into the car and fell asleep before they reached the highway. Ethan drove home in the dark with the radio off and the windows up and the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. And 3 houses down, when he pulled into his driveway, the porch light was on at Victoria Bennett's house. He noticed it. He didn't know why he noticed it, but he did. The porch light at Victoria's house was off by the time Ethan woke up the next morning. He knew this because he looked. He was standing at the kitchen window with his first cup of coffee at 6:53, watching the neighborhood come alive in the particular slow way Sunday mornings do. A dog walker passing, a car backing out 2 houses down. The Kellerman kid across the street retrieving a newspaper from the driveway in his pajamas, and his eyes moved, without him consciously directing them, 3 houses to the left. The light was off. Her car was in the driveway. The front curtains were drawn. He looked away and drank his coffee. Mason came downstairs at 7:15 with his hair doing something unusual on one side and his pajama top on backwards, which he either hadn't noticed or had decided not to care about. He sat down at the table and regarded his father with the evaluative calm he brought to most morning situations. How do you feel? Mason asked. Fine. How do you feel? Good. I slept the whole drive home. I know. You were snoring before we hit the highway. I don't snore. You absolutely snore. Mason looked skeptical, but chose not to pursue it. He pulled a box of cereal toward him and poured a bowl with the focused attention of someone performing a task they take seriously. Ethan refilled his coffee and sat down across from him. Did you have a good time? Mason asked. Ethan considered the question. It was genuine. Mason asked genuine questions, which meant it deserved a genuine answer. Yeah, he said. Actually, yeah. Mason nodded like this confirmed something. Victoria seemed nice. She is. She didn't talk to me like I was little. Ethan looked at his son. What do you mean? Some adults talk to kids like they're small and don't understand things. She just talked regular. He shrugged, spooning cereal. I like that. Ethan turned his coffee mug in his hands and said nothing, because there wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't be either too much or not enough. They ate breakfast with the Sunday quiet around them and the late June light coming through the window, and Ethan did not look toward the street again. He told himself he wasn't going to. He did, twice more before noon. The second time, her car was gone. The third time, it was back, and she was carrying grocery bags from the trunk to her front door, and she was wearing a dark blue sweatshirt, and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who had not been a CEO at all that morning and had simply gone to buy food for the week. He watched her make 2 trips to the car and back. She didn't look toward his house. He went and mowed the lawn. It was, he recognized, slightly ridiculous. He was 32 years old. He had a job and a son and a mortgage and an overdue report on the structural assessment of a downtown office building, and he was mowing his lawn on a Sunday afternoon because a woman 3 houses away had smiled at him the night before and said things that made him feel like a person who existed in 3 dimensions rather than 1.5. The lawn looked better after. That part was real. He was putting the mower away when he heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up. Victoria was walking past. Same sweatshirt, earbuds in, head slightly down. And she would have kept going if she hadn't glanced up and caught him standing there in his driveway holding a pair of work gloves. She pulled one earbud out. "Lawn," she said. "Lawn," he confirmed. "Only took 7 months. I had a busy spring. What changed?" He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the same slight warmth he'd noticed at the wedding, the kind that didn't push but didn't pretend not to be there either. "Felt like time," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then she almost smiled. Not quite, just the beginning of one, and put the earbud back in. "Looks good, Brooks," she said, and kept walking. He stood in his driveway and watched her round the corner. Then he went inside and finished the report. The work took him 2 hours. Mason made sandwiches for dinner, which was their Sunday tradition, and afterward they watched half a movie before Mason fell asleep on the couch, and Ethan carried him upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed for longer than was strictly necessary. He did that sometimes. Had done it since the beginning, when the nights were the worst and the only thing that helped was sitting in the dark and listening to his son breathe. He did it less now. The nights were not the worst anymore, had not been for a long time, but some evenings he still ended up here, in the quiet of Mason's room, for no reason he could fully articulate except that it helped to remember what was solid. Mason's room smelled like kid, like the particular combination of whatever shampoo Ethan bought in bulk, and the slight earthiness that came from a child who spent real time outdoors and didn't always fully convince soap to reach the back of his neck. There were books stacked in a way that suggested organization had been attempted and partially abandoned. A solar system mobile hung from the ceiling, a gift from Sarah's mother that Mason had insisted on keeping even as his tastes had grown more sophisticated. Ethan looked at the planets turning slightly in the draft from the open window. Sarah had loved that mobile. She'd hung it herself, standing on a chair, arguing good-naturedly with Ethan about whether Pluto deserved to be included. She'd included it. Reclassified or not, she'd said, it was still out there. He sat in the dark for a while and then went downstairs and cleaned up the kitchen and went to bed, and he did not think about Victoria Bennett except for maybe 10 minutes before he fell asleep, which felt, under the circumstances, like a reasonable number. The week passed the way weeks did. Monday through Friday had a structure that Ethan had built with considerable intentionality over the past 4 years, the kind of structure you build because you've learned that without it, the days have a tendency to develop holes that are hard to climb out of. School run at 7:40. Work by 8:30. Lunch at his desk more often than not, because the report deadline had migrated, and his project manager had the specific talent of moving deadlines in ways that felt entirely reasonable until you were working through lunch for the 3rd week in a row. Pick up Mason at 3:15. The stretch from 3:15 to 8, homework, dinner, bath, the 45-minute negotiation that was bedtime, was its own kind of dense, exhausting, sustaining. He saw Victoria twice that week from a distance. Once Tuesday morning, when she was already in her car and pulling out as he was loading Mason's backpack into his. She lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in a wave without slowing down. The second time was Thursday evening, when she was on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, expression doing exactly what Mason had described, and she caught Ethan's eye as he walked to the mailbox and made a face that communicated clearly, "You have no idea how tedious this phone call is." He made a face back that he hoped communicated, deeply sympathetic. She turned away, still talking, but he saw the corner of her mouth move before she did. He got the mail. There were 2 bills, a school newsletter, and a coupon for a pizza place he'd never been to. He went back inside and made pasta and helped Mason with a worksheet about state capitals and did not think about the corner of her mouth. Much. On Friday, Claire called. He let it ring twice, a reflex, not reluctance, and then picked up. "Hey." "So," Claire said. No preamble, just so. "Claire." "I'm only calling to say hi." "You're not calling to say hi." "I'm calling to say hi and also to ask you one simple question, and if you tell me not to ask it, I will absolutely respect that and not ask it." A pause. "Did you and Victoria exchange numbers?" Ethan sat down on the couch. "No." Silence. "We talked," he said. "At your wedding, that's it." "You talked for 4 hours." "I didn't realize you were clocking it." "James clocked it. James pointed it out to me. My husband, who notices approximately nothing, noticed this." Her voice was careful, not excited, not pushing, which was effort for Claire, and he knew it. "I'm not saying anything. I know. I just thought, Claire." "Okay." She exhaled. "Okay. How's Mason? How's work?" They talked for 20 minutes about Mason and work and how the honeymoon had been. Greece, 2 weeks. James had gotten mildly sunburned despite extensive sunscreen application. And when they hung up, Ethan sat with his phone for a moment and then put it face down on the cushion beside him. He picked it up again and looked at it. Then he put it back down. He didn't have her number. That was just a fact. He could get it from Claire, who would give it to him with a speed that would border on unseemly. He thought about it practically, the way he thought about structural problems, looking for the actual shape of the obstacle. He could also simply walk 3 houses down the street and knock on a door, which was a thing people did. He did not do either of these things on Friday. He also didn't do them on Saturday morning, though he thought about it twice during Mason's soccer practice, sitting on the cold metal bleachers watching his son argue good-naturedly with a kid named Brandon about whether the ball had crossed the line, which it very clearly had, Brandon. What stopped him was not fear exactly. He'd been trying to name it for a week, and he kept arriving at the same answer. It wasn't that he was afraid of rejection. It wasn't even that he was afraid of what it meant to reach toward someone again. It was something more specific than that. It was the awareness that the last time he'd begun something, it had mattered in ways that had rearranged the entire architecture of his life. And when it ended, when Sarah ended, the rearrangement didn't undo itself. You just had to live in a structure that had been built for 2 with one person doing the load-bearing work of both. He wasn't sure he knew how to begin something that might matter again. He wasn't sure he knew how to do it without being certain it was real, and you couldn't know if something was real until you'd already started. Mason scored a goal in the second half and turned around with his arm in the air, looking for Ethan in the bleachers. Ethan stood up and raised both hands, and Mason grinned, the full, uncalculated grin that he saved for real victories, and turned back to the field. Ethan sat back down. On Saturday afternoon, he was in the backyard with a book he hadn't fully started yet when he heard his back gate open. He looked up. It was Mason, who had been playing in the front yard and had apparently decided to take a shortcut through the side. And behind Mason, in the way of a person who has been invited by a small and very self-possessed child without the small child necessarily informing his father, was Victoria. She stopped when she saw Ethan. Something flickered across her face. The awareness that she'd been, in some sense, managed. "Mason said you were back here," she said. "He did," Ethan confirmed, looking at his son. Mason sat down on the grass near the fence with complete composure, like he'd simply been walking and happened to arrive here. "I was telling her about the rosebush," he said. Ethan looked at the rosebush. Victoria looked at the rosebush. "It's had a rough year," Ethan said. "It looks okay," Victoria said. "It always looks okay. It's the most persistent thing I own." She came further into the yard, looking at it properly. She was in jeans and an old t-shirt from what appeared to be a half marathon she'd run several years ago, and she crouched down near the rosebush and looked at it with a focused attention that reminded him, absurdly, of how Mason looked at things. "It needs water," she said. "I water it." "More water." "How do you know that?" She looked up at him with an expression that was trying not to be amused. "My mother grew roses. I spent approximately 15 summers being her assistant, whether I wanted to or not." She stood up, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I'll bring you something, a fertilizer mix she used. It's nothing complicated. You don't have to. I have it. It's just sitting in my garage." She said it cleanly, without making it into anything it didn't need to be. I'll bring it by. Okay, he said. Thank you. She nodded and then looked at Mason on the grass. You engineered this. Mason looked up from where he'd been pulling at a grass blade with tremendous concentration. I was just showing you the backyard. Uh-huh. It's a nice backyard. Mason, Ethan said. What? You're 8. I know, Mason said, in the tone of someone who found this entirely beside the point. Victoria laughed. The same laugh he'd heard at the wedding, unguarded and real. And some of the tension that Ethan had been holding somewhere in his shoulders without fully realizing it simply wasn't there anymore. Do you want coffee? He heard himself say. She looked at him. Yeah, she said. Actually, yeah. They sat on the back porch, Ethan on one of the 2 mismatched chairs that had been there since he and Sarah moved in, Victoria on the other, while Mason drifted back to the front yard with the soccer ball and the specific independence of a child who knows the rules of his perimeter. The coffee was nothing special, the kind Ethan bought in large bags from the grocery store because he went through it fast enough that buying good coffee felt like a frivolity. He almost apologized for it. He didn't. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the yard. This is a good yard, she said. Mason basically lives out here from May to October. Do you? Not as much as I should. He said it honestly. I use it to work sometimes. Mostly, I just look at it from the kitchen window. That sounds familiar? You have a yard? A small one. It's mostly patio. I'm better at maintaining things with less surface area. She paused. I'm better at maintaining most things with less surface area. He wasn't entirely sure what she meant by that, and something about the fact that he wasn't sure felt important, like the edge of something he didn't fully understand yet. He let it sit. How was your week? She asked. Long. I had a report deadline that moved twice and then moved back. You? Board meeting Wednesday. Someone tried to question a growth projection I've been building for 8 months. She said it with the calm of someone who had won whatever disagreement followed. It got resolved. I have no doubt. She looked at him sideways. What does that mean? It means you seem like someone who gets things resolved. Is that a compliment? I think so. You think so? It was meant to be. She smiled into her coffee cup, and he felt it. The specific warmth of making someone smile when you weren't entirely sure you were going to, when it wasn't something you'd engineered, but something that just happened because you were both there. Marcus was in finance, she said. It arrived without preamble, the way these things did between them now. Not segued into, just said. Investment banking. He worked incredible hours. We had whole weeks where the only time we were in the same room was 3 in the morning when one of us was getting water. Did that bother you? It bothered me more in retrospect than it did at the time. She turned the mug in her hands. At the time I understood it. We were both building things. We thought there would be time later to slow down. A pause. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes with that realization. Yeah, he said. There is. She looked at him. Sarah and I were good, he said. We were actually good at the end. By the time she got sick, we'd worked through most of the things couples have to work through, and we were solid. And somehow that makes it... He stopped because the sentence had several endings and none of them were comfortable. It's its own particular thing, he finished. Every version of it is its own particular thing, she said. Have you talked to anyone? I mean, a therapist. Yes. For 2 years. She said it without any defensiveness. It helped. Not in the way I expected, but it helped. I went for a while, Ethan said. Right after. Mason's been seeing someone too, since just someone at his school, a counselor. I wasn't sure at first. He seemed okay. He still seems okay, but I think it's better to have it than not. Yeah. From the front of the house, they could hear the thump of Mason's soccer ball against the fence, a regular rhythm like a heartbeat, and they sat with it between them and drank their coffee. I should let you have your Saturday, Victoria said after a while. You're not... He stopped, started differently. You don't have to. She looked at him again, and there was something careful and honest in it. I know I don't, she said. She didn't move immediately. She finished her coffee. She looked at the rosebush once more. Then she stood up and took her mug inside. He said he'd get it, and she said she had it, and she was already inside, already placing it carefully in the sink, and came back out to the porch and picked up her phone from where she'd left it on the railing. I'll bring the fertilizer by this week, she said. You really don't? Ethan. She said his name with a patience that was not unkind. The rosebush needs it. I have it. It's not complicated. He looked at her. Okay. Okay. She stepped off the porch and started across the yard toward the back gate. Then she paused and half-turned. For what it's worth, she said, I don't usually do this either. Do what? Come into people's backyards and drink their mediocre coffee. He felt the heat of that before he could stop it. It's not that mediocre. It's a little mediocre. I'm going to buy better coffee. That would be a good start. She pushed the gate open and then, without looking back, See you around, Brooks. See you around, he said. He stood on his back porch for a moment after the gate closed, and he was aware that his chest was doing something that was not exactly comfortable and not exactly unpleasant, something that had texture and weight to it that he hadn't felt in a long time. He picked up his own mug. He looked at the rosebush. He went inside and looked up better coffee brands on his phone. He bought 2 bags from an online roaster, Ground, which arrived on Tuesday. He felt somewhat ridiculous about this. He also felt, underneath the slight ridiculousness, something lighter than he'd felt in longer than he wanted to calculate. Victoria came by Wednesday evening with a small container of fertilizer mix and instructions that were so specific and practical that he wrote them down. Mason materialized from somewhere in the house within 3 minutes of her arrival, which Ethan was fairly certain was not a coincidence, and she answered his questions about the fertilizer, how it worked, why plants needed it, what happened if you gave them too much, with the same directness she gave to everything. You could be a teacher, Mason told her. I have 200 employees, she said. I already am one. Mason considered this. Do they listen? Not always. Does it bother you? Less than it used to. Mason nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he filed something away. I think you'd be good at it, he said, and went back inside. Ethan and Victoria stood on the front porch, and the evening was warm, the kind of warm that June delivers sometimes like a promise of what July is going to do, and she was smiling faintly at the door Mason had just disappeared through. He really is something, she said. He's going to be a very interesting adult. He already is. She looked at Ethan. You doing okay? This week, I mean. The question landed differently than most people's version of it. Most people were asking, are you functional? Are you coping? Is the machine running? Hers was something more specific. Better week than last week, he said honestly. Good. You? She thought about it. The board thing is resolved. I slept a full night Tuesday, which felt like a genuine achievement. She paused. Better than last week. Good. They stood on the porch in the warm evening, and he was very aware that this was the 5th time they'd talked in 2 weeks, and that each time felt slightly more like the last one naturally continued than like starting over, the way it sometimes felt with people you were trying to get to know. It didn't feel like effort. It felt like he searched for the right word and kept arriving at the same one, like ease. Real ease, not performed ease. The kind that's uncomfortable to admit you found because admitting it means acknowledging that you'd been without it for a while. I bought better coffee, he said. She looked at him. For next time, he said. If there's a next time, she said. Not a question. He nodded. She went back down the porch steps and started toward her house, and Ethan leaned against the doorframe and watched the evening and thought, he had no idea where this was going, and he had no plan, and he couldn't see past the next conversation, and somehow, that was not a reason to stop. It was just where he was. He went inside. Mason was at the kitchen table working on something that turned out to be a drawing. People, stick-figured, but with considerable attention to the details of their clothing, which Ethan slowly realized were a man, a child, and a woman standing in front of a house. He didn't say anything about it. He got out a pot and started making dinner and let Mason draw, and the evening settled around them like something that was trying to stay. He let it, The better coffee made a difference. Not a dramatic difference. It wasn't going to fix anything that was broken or speed up anything that needed time. But when Victoria sat down on his back porch, 2 Saturdays after she'd brought the fertilizer, and wrapped both hands around the mug the same way she had the first time, she took a sip and looked at him with an expression that acknowledged, without making a production of it, that he had done what he said he would do. "Better," she said. "I did research. I can tell. 2 different roasters, blind taste test." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "You did a blind taste test." Mason helped. What did Mason think? He said they both tasted like coffee, and he didn't understand the point. Then he drank half my cup. She smiled and looked out at the yard. The rosebush had responded to the fertilizer with an enthusiasm that Ethan found slightly embarrassing given how little he'd done. There were actual buds now, small and tight, the deep red of something working up to being itself. She noticed them before he said anything. "There you go," she said. "It's showing off." Plants do that when someone pays attention to them. He looked at her. She was looking at the rosebush with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was in that neighborhood. The way people look at things they helped fix that they had no obligation to help fix. He felt, not for the first time in the past 2 weeks, the specific difficulty of being near someone who made ordinary things feel less ordinary without appearing to try. It was getting harder to pretend he didn't notice it. Mason came out with a book under his arm. A thick one. Something about space exploration that his grandmother had given him for his birthday, and that he had been working through with considerable dedication, and sat on the top porch step without asking permission, which was something he did now when Victoria was there. He positioned himself close enough to be in the conversation if it came to him, far enough to have plausible deniability about having invited himself. Ethan watched his son do this with the awareness that 8-year-olds were significantly less subtle than they believed themselves to be. "The buds are red," Mason said, without looking up from his book. "They are," Victoria said. "What kind of rose is it?" "I'm not sure," Ethan said. "It was here when we moved in." "Your mom planted it," Mason said. He said it to Ethan, still looking at his book, the way he sometimes said things about Sarah. Matter of fact, present, not building walls around it, but not making a moment out of it either. "She told me it was a climbing rose. She said it would grow on the fence if we let it." The yard went quiet for a second. Not an uncomfortable quiet, just still. "You should let it," Victoria said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "We should." Mason turned a page. The morning went the way their mornings had started going, without agenda, without anything that needed to happen or anywhere anyone needed to be. Victoria asked about his work, and he explained the project he'd been on, an assessment of a 40-year-old office building downtown, the way old buildings accumulated problems in layers so that fixing one thing usually revealed 2 things underneath it. She listened the way she listened, which was completely without the half attention people gave to things they were waiting to respond to. "It sounds like the company after the Marcus situation," she said at one point. He looked at her. She said it naturally, worked it in without flagging it as significant. "How so?" "When he died, I had the company, and the company needed me, and it was... I kept finding things he'd been carrying that I hadn't known about, problems under problems." She paused. "It took about a year before I felt like I actually understood the full shape of what I'd taken on." "Did that help, having the company?" She thought about it carefully. "It gave me somewhere to put the part of my brain that needed to be working. I don't know if that's healthy or not. It's just what happened." "Sarah got sick in February," Ethan said. "She was gone by August. I had Mason and work, and I barely stopped moving for the first year. I thought that was bad. My therapist said it wasn't necessarily. It's what you needed. It was what I knew how to do. Sometimes those are the same thing." He nodded. Mason turned another page. They had lunch that day. Nothing planned, just the progression of the morning hitting noon, and Ethan making sandwiches because making sandwiches was something he could do without thinking, and he wanted to keep talking. Victoria sat at his kitchen table and ate a turkey sandwich and argued with Mason about whether the moon landing could have been faked. Mason's position was that it categorically could not, on the basis of several logistical arguments he presented with the energy of a prosecutor. And Ethan stood at the counter eating his own sandwich and watched the 2 of them, and felt something move through him that he didn't fully have a name for. Not happiness, exactly. More like the beginning of something adjacent to it, like the way the air feels before rain. She left around 2. At the door she paused and looked at him with that careful, direct expression. "Same time next week?" she said. "If you want." "I'm asking if you want." He met her eyes. "Yeah," he said, "I want." She nodded once and went down the steps and walked back toward her house, and Ethan stood in his open doorway and thought he was not going to be able to keep treating this as something casual. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The question was what exactly he wanted it to be instead. He thought about that more than he should have over the following week. He thought about it on the school run and during a structural review meeting, and once, briefly, while standing in the cereal aisle of the grocery store for so long that another shopper asked if he was all right. He was all right. He was just thinking. The difficulty was this. Whatever was building between them was building on ground that had already been broken once. Both of them knew it. Neither of them was operating from a place of uncomplicated availability. They came with weight, with history, with the specific caution of people who understood what loss actually cost. That should have made things simpler, in a way. There was no pretending between them. No performance of being fine when they weren't. No optimistic simplification of what they were carrying. But it also meant that moving forward required something he wasn't sure he could fully manufacture. A willingness to be uncertain. To begin something without knowing its shape. To risk being in the middle of something that might not hold. He had built his entire life after Sarah on the principle of controlled exposure. He didn't take on more than he could manage. He didn't let things grow that he couldn't tend. He had Mason and work and the house and a careful, maintained life that ran on routine and intention. Victoria was not a routine. She was not something he could plan. And yet here he was, buying better coffee and watching the school-run clock so he could time when he left in case her car was still in the driveway. He was aware this was not controlled. He went for a run on Thursday evening after Mason was asleep, which he did sometimes when the inside of his head needed somewhere to go. The neighborhood was that kind of summer evening quiet where people were on porches and the light was low and the air had finally cooled to something reasonable. He ran the usual loop, down to the park, around the duck pond that Mason had named Pond, despite considerable encouragement toward more creative naming, back up the long way through the side streets. He was on the return leg, breathing harder than he wanted to be when he saw her. Victoria was sitting on her front porch steps, not on the phone this time, just sitting. She had a glass of something, water maybe, or something with ice. And she was looking at the street, and when Ethan slowed and stopped at the bottom of her walk, she looked at him with the unsurprised expression of someone who had learned not to be surprised by things. "You run," she said. Apparently. He was breathing harder than he wanted. Irregularly. Irregularly, she repeated, like this tracked with something she'd already suspected. He walked to the bottom of her porch steps, because stopping in front of someone's house for extended conversation while they were on the steps, and you were on the sidewalk, started to feel strange after a certain number of seconds. She looked at his face, and then at her glass, and then said, "Water?" "Sure." She went inside and he sat on the bottom step and caught his breath and looked at her street from this angle, which was slightly different from his street's angle 3 houses down. The evening was the same from here, same light, same quiet, but the particular view of the oak tree at the corner was different, and the Nguyen family's wind chimes sounded slightly different from this vantage, and it was the kind of small thing that was also not small at all, being in someone else's particular position. She came back with 2 glasses and sat on the step above him, which put her slightly higher, and they sat like that and drank water and watched the street. "Bad week?" he asked. "Not bad. Long." She paused. "We're going through a funding round. It takes up a particular kind of mental real estate." "Can you talk about it?" "Vaguely." She did. Gave him the broad shape of it, a Series C round, the exhaustion of investor conversations, the specific frustration of justifying a company's value to people who wanted certainty she couldn't honestly give them. She spoke about it clearly, but without the performance he sometimes saw in ambitious people. The need to make their professional life sound like a narrative of conquest. She was just talking about a hard thing she was doing. How did you start it? He asked. The company. Marcus. She said it simply. He had a logistics background, and he kept talking about how broken supply chain communication was. He'd map things out on whiteboards for me on Sunday mornings, how information got lost between manufacturers and distributors, why delays happened that didn't need to happen. He thought the software space was wide open. She turned the glass in her hands. He never built it. He always meant to. And after, I had an engineering background. I had his notes. I had a lot of anger and nowhere to put it. You built his company. I built a company. I don't know if it's his. I think it's mine now. She considered. I think he'd be annoyed at some of my decisions and right about why. Was he usually right? Often enough to be irritating. A pause. Was Sarah? Ethan thought about it honestly. In the ways that mattered, she was better at people than I was. She'd meet someone and understand something about them in 20 minutes that would take me a year. He paused. She knew Mason was going to be serious before he was a year old. She said he had an old soul. I thought that was... I didn't take it seriously. She was completely right. You take it seriously now. I take everything about him seriously, maybe too seriously. Maybe, she said, or maybe you're a parent who pays attention. There's a version of paying attention that's just anxiety with better PR. She laughed, short and real. That's accurate. She looked at him. You see a therapist still? Sporadically, when things pile up. He looked back at the street. You? Once a month now. More of a maintenance thing. A pause. She asked me last week if there was anyone new in my life. He was very still. I said I'd met someone in my neighborhood, Victoria said. She asked if it felt like something. I said I wasn't sure yet. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the street, not at him, and her profile in the low light was composed and honest the way she was composed and honest about everything. What did she say? He asked. She said not being sure was okay. Victoria glanced at him. That sometimes the not sure part is the honest part and it's worth paying attention to. He held her gaze. Yeah, he said. I think that's right. She looked away first, back to the street, and they sat in the quiet for another few minutes. A car passed. The wind chimes at the Nguyen's moved. 2 houses down, someone's sprinkler came on. I should finish the run, he said, though he was in no hurry. You stopped 10 minutes ago. The run is finished. The loop isn't. You can finish the loop tomorrow. He looked at her, and she was looking back at him with an expression that was not quite an invitation and not quite its absence. Just open. A door that wasn't locked. I have bad days, he said. Not as a confession, more like something he needed her to have on record. Where the whole thing comes back and I'm not good company and I don't always know when it's coming. I know, she said. I have those too. I don't know how to do this without being careful. I'm not asking you not to be careful. What are you asking? She was quiet for a moment, not performing the quiet, just actually thinking. I'm not asking anything, she said finally. I'm just here, on my porch. She held up her water glass. Offering hydration. Despite everything, he laughed. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. He finished the water and handed her the glass and went back to the sidewalk and finished the loop. And when he passed her house on the return, she was still on the porch step with her own glass, and she raised it slightly as he went by, and he raised one hand and kept going. He slept better that night than he had in weeks. The following Saturday, she arrived at his back porch with a paper bag from the bakery on 5th that he'd passed 100 times and never gone into, containing 2 coffee pastries and what she described as a completely unnecessary amount of almond croissant for 2 people, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. Mason discovered the bag within minutes and negotiated a piece of croissant with a seriousness that he applied to most negotiations, and they ate on the back porch in the Saturday morning light, and the rose bush was doing something new. One bud had opened, not all the way, but enough, a deep red uncurling at the edge. Victoria looked at it for a long moment. There it is, she said quietly. Yeah, Ethan said. They had better coffee and the almond croissant, and Mason read them 3 facts about black holes that he'd been saving for a receptive audience. At some point, the conversation shifted from easy things to a thing that had been at the edges for a while. He wasn't sure who moved it there. It arrived the way honest things did between them, without engineering. "My sister thinks I should ask you to dinner," he said. "I know," Victoria said. "She texted me." He stopped. "She texted you?" "Last week." "Of course she did." He put his coffee down. "I'm going to have a serious conversation with my sister." She was very enthusiastic. She's always very enthusiastic. She has zero... "I'm sorry. Don't apologize for your sister." Victoria was watching him with an expression that had amusement in it and something else that was less easy to identify. "She loves you." "It's obvious." "It is obvious. It's also invasive." "Both things can be true." He looked at her. How did you respond to her?" "I said I appreciated the thought, which means I appreciated the thought and I wanted to have whatever conversation was going to happen with you, not with your well-meaning sister." He exhaled. "Fair." "So?" She held his gaze, direct as always. No pretending the question wasn't there. "Is this you asking me to dinner?" He felt the moment with its full weight, not in a melodramatic way, in the way that some moments actually deserved to be felt, because they were real and their outcomes would be real, and the people involved had already learned that real things could cost enormously. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said honestly. "I know. I haven't done this since... I haven't done this. Same. I'm not going to be easy." "Neither am I. I run a company, I have complicated feelings about every major decision I've made in the last 3 years, and I have a therapist who will absolutely want to hear about all of this on her next available appointment." She said it without irony, just fact. Easy was never on the table. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "Friday. If you're free, there's a place downtown I've been meaning to try for 2 years and never had a reason to." "That's a long time to not have a reason." "I had reasons, I just didn't use them." Something in her expression shifted, subtle, but there. "Friday," she said. "I'm free." "Okay. Okay." Mason appeared at the back door with his book and another space fact and looked between the two adults on the porch with the careful attention he gave to situations he found interesting. He didn't say anything about whatever he observed. He just sat down on the step and opened his book. "Did you know," he announced, "that a neutron star is so dense that a teaspoon of it would weigh 1 billion tons?" "That's a lot," Victoria said. "It's more than a lot. It's basically incomprehensible." "Most of the most interesting things are," she said. Mason looked at her with the expression he reserved for adults who gave good answers to his good questions. Then he looked at his father, then back at his book. "Okay," he said, which in Mason's vocabulary could mean anything from "I accept this" to "I have processed this and filed it and will return to it later," and Ethan had learned to read the distinction. This one meant, "Good. Proceed." Ethan looked at Victoria. She was looking at the open rosebud, her coffee in both hands, the Saturday light on her face, and she looked like someone who had been through a great deal and had not been made small by it. Someone who was also clearly slightly nervous, though she would not have described it that way. He knew, because he was too. He thought about what his therapist had told him in the second year, when Ethan had asked how you knew when you were ready. His therapist, a practical, slightly sardonic man named Dr. Reeves, who had very little patience for Ethan's tendency to approach emotional questions as engineering problems, had said, "You don't, generally. You just notice that the fear of staying still has gotten larger than the fear of moving." He hadn't known what that meant then. He thought he was starting to understand it now. Friday came the way Fridays did when you were waiting for them, with the particular pacing of a week that was going slowly on the days it shouldn't and fast on the ones you needed. He arranged for his mother to have Mason for the night, which his mother accepted with a restraint that cost her visibly. She did not ask where he was going. She asked if Mason needed anything specific packed. She kissed Ethan on the cheek when she left and said, "Have a good time," with an emphasis on good time that contained approximately 14 years of concern compressed into 3 syllables. He changed his shirt twice. The first was too formal. The second was fine. He looked at himself in the mirror with the specific dissatisfaction of a man who hadn't dressed for anything in a long time and had lost confidence in his own judgment about it. He went with the second shirt. He knocked on Victoria's door at 7. She answered in less than a minute, wearing something dark and simple that suggested she'd also made a decision about what to wear without making the decision look labored, which he suspected was its own form of labor. She had a small jacket over one arm. She looked like herself, which he was realizing was the best version of any compliment he could think of. "Hi," she said. "Hi." They stood in her doorway for a second. "You look good," he said. "You changed your shirt twice," she said. He stared at her. "How do you—" "I have a window that faces your side of the street." She said it without any apology. "I wasn't watching, I just noticed. The first one was too formal. The second one is better." "Thank you," he said. "I think." She smiled and pulled the door shut behind her, and they walked down her front steps and to his car, and neither of them filled the space with unnecessary conversation, which he found, again, the specific relief of. The restaurant was a small Italian place downtown called Novella that had been on his list since a colleague had mentioned it offhandedly during a lunch break 18 months ago. It had maybe 16 tables, low light, the kind of menu that wasn't long but was thought about. He'd made the reservation on Monday, changed the time on Wednesday, confirmed on Thursday like a person whose executive function was running slightly ragged around the edges. The hostess sat them in a corner booth. The menu arrived. They ordered wine. Victoria knew what she wanted immediately. Ethan took slightly longer. And the restaurant settled around them like it did when you're somewhere good, the background noise becoming texture rather than intrusion. "Tell me something I don't know about you," Victoria said when the wine arrived. Not a party question, just a real one. He thought about it. "I wanted to be an architect, not a structural engineer. Architect." "What happened?" "I looked at the actual market for architects versus structural engineers in my second year and made a practical decision." He paused. "I sometimes think about what I would have designed." "What would you have designed?" "I don't know. Something that looked like it grew there. Not imposed." He turned his wine glass. "You?" "I was supposed to do medicine," she said. "My parents were very committed to the idea. I did 2 years and realized I was better at the systems around medicine than the medicine itself. Switched to engineering. My father didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a long time. He came around. He's proud of the company now. He's also still occasionally passive-aggressive about the medical degree." She said it with the matter-of-fact tolerance of someone who has long accepted a particular family dynamic. "Your parents?" "My dad died when I was 19. Heart attack. My mom, she's good. She tries not to worry about me loudly." "Does she succeed?" "Imperfectly, but she tries." The food arrived. They ate and talked, and he noticed that talking to her in a restaurant felt like the same thing as talking to her on the back porch, which was not nothing. Some people were different in contexts that had expectations attached, became more performance and less person. She was the same, direct and dry and occasionally funny in the way she'd been from the beginning, and she asked questions that were real questions and listened to the answers. Somewhere in the second hour, the conversation moved, the way it always did between them, into territory that had more weight. "Do you think Marcus would have liked me?" Ethan asked. He wasn't sure what made him ask it. It arrived. She considered it seriously. He would have been skeptical at first. He had long evaluation periods for people. She picked up her wine. "But yes, eventually." She looked at him. "Would Sarah have liked me?" "She would have liked you immediately, and then told me what she'd figured out about you that I'd missed." "What do you think she'd have figured out?" "That you're braver than you let people see." He said it without thinking, and then it was there between them and he couldn't unsay it. Victoria was very still for a moment. "I don't know if that's true," she said. "I think it is." She looked at him. Not the careful diagnostic look, not the composed CEO expression. Something more unguarded than that, something he'd seen in pieces before and not all at once. "This is the part," she said quietly, "where I would normally make a joke or change the subject." "I know. I'm going to try not to." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them, the clink of glasses, a couple laughing 2 tables over, a server crossing the floor. "I'm scared," she said. Just that. "Me too," he said. Not a conclusion, not a resolution, just 2 true things sitting on a table in a restaurant where the food was good and the light was low, and outside the summer night was doing what summer nights did, moving slowly and warm. He didn't reach across the table. She didn't move, but the space between them, that particular charged space that had been building since a wedding and a lawn and a rose bush and 2 people who understood each other's particular kind of quiet, felt, for the first time, less like distance, more like a pause before something. He wasn't sure what. But for the first time in 4 years, he was willing to wait and find out. He walked her home. It wasn't a decision exactly. They'd taken his car to the restaurant, and he parked back on the street, and they both got out and stood in the warm night, and the logical thing was for him to walk her to her door, so he did. 3 houses felt shorter than it had ever felt. The neighborhood was quiet the way it got after 10. The particular suburban quiet of a street where most people had gone inside and the lights in windows were the soft kind. Lamps rather than overhead fixtures, people winding down. They walked slowly. Neither of them said much. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid. It was more like the silence of 2 people who had said something real over dinner and needed a few minutes to let it settle before the evening ended. Ethan had his hands in his pockets. Victoria had her jacket over her arm because the night had stayed warm. At her porch steps, she stopped and turned. "I had a good time," she said. "Me too." She looked at him for a moment in that direct way. "That surprised me." "A little." "Having a good time?" "How much?" She paused. "I'd built in an exit strategy. 45 minutes in, if things were—" She made a vague gesture. "I had a work call I could have remembered. You had a fake work call ready." "I always have a fake work call ready. It's a professional survival skill." "Did you need it?" "No," she said. "I didn't." He looked at her on the bottom step of her porch in the summer night and felt everything he'd felt at dinner. The fear and the wanting and the very specific difficulty of being a person who understood loss and was trying to move forward anyway. And he did something that surprised him. He didn't move. Not because he didn't want to, but because he thought they were both standing at something that deserved to be stood at for a moment before they crossed it. Some things you didn't want to rush, not because you were afraid, but because you understood their weight. "Friday was a good start," he said. Something in her expression loosened. "Yeah," she said. "It was." "Same time next week? Are you going to keep asking me that after everything?" "I like the ritual of it." She almost smiled. "Same time next week," she said. She went up the steps, and he waited until she'd unlocked the door and turned back once. Just once. No wave. Just a look that carried what looks can carry when there are no more words needed. And then he walked back 3 houses in the warm night and went inside and stood in his own kitchen for a while without turning on any lights. His mother had texted at 9:30. "Mason is fine, asleep, don't rush in the morning. How are things going?" He typed back, "Good. Actually good." His mother's response took 14 seconds. "I'm so glad, sweetheart." He put the phone down and stood in the dark kitchen and let himself feel it. The good, the complicated, the scared, all of it at once. And then he went to bed. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the ones before. Not immediately. Things didn't transform overnight, and he was suspicious of narratives where they did, because that hadn't been his experience of real change. Real change was slow and uneven and looked different depending on the day you were having. But something had shifted, incrementally and then less incrementally, and by mid-July he was able to notice it without immediately questioning whether he was allowed to. They had dinner again the following Friday, and the Friday after that. They did not call it anything. They did not have the conversation that would have required naming it, not because they were avoiding it, but because neither of them was in a hurry, and both of them understood the value of letting things develop at the pace they actually needed, rather than the pace you thought they should. Saturday mornings on the back porch continued. Victoria started bringing things. The bakery pastries became a fixture, and once a container of her mother's soup recipe that she'd made on a Sunday evening, with an air of someone who'd been talked into it by their own nostalgia, and Ethan ate 2 bowls of it and told her honestly it was the best thing he'd eaten in months, and she looked at once pleased and slightly embarrassed by this, which was its own kind of information. Mason continued to insert himself into mornings with the smooth self-assurance of someone who had decided he approved and was not particularly interested in pretending otherwise. He and Victoria had developed their own dynamic, which Ethan watched with something that took him a while to identify as relief. It wasn't that Mason was easy. He was never exactly easy. He was too attentive and too direct for easy. But Victoria handled his attentiveness the way she handled most things, straight on, without flinching. One Saturday, Mason came out to the porch and announced without preamble that he had a question for her. "Okay," Victoria said. "Did you want to have kids?" Ethan put his coffee down. "Mason," he started. "It's a real question," Mason said, looking at his father. "I'm not asking to be rude. I want to know." Victoria looked at Ethan briefly, a look that said, "It's okay, I've got this," and turned to Mason. "Yes," she said. "Marcus and I talked about it. We were going to start trying." She said it without flinching. "Then he died." Mason absorbed this. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something he found genuinely difficult. "Do you still want them?" "Mason," Ethan said quietly. I don't know," Victoria said, which was clearly the true answer. "I think about it sometimes. I'm 30. The question doesn't go away just because the circumstances changed." Mason nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then, I think you'd be good at it." He went back inside. Ethan and Victoria sat with the echo of that for a moment. "He's 8, Ethan said by way of apology. "He's 8, and he asked the thing everyone else is too polite to ask." She looked at the door he'd gone through. "I didn't mind it. He does that. He finds the actual question." "I know. That's why I didn't mind it." She paused. "The actual answer is, I don't know. That's not me being evasive." "I know it isn't." She looked at him. He looked back. The question sat between them, not threatening, not requiring anything right now, just present in the way real questions were present when you were building something with someone whose life was already built around a child. "Does it?" she started. "No," he said. He didn't need to hear the rest of it. "That's not something you need to have figured out. It might need to be figured out eventually." "Eventually," he agreed. "Not today." She nodded once and looked at the rose bush. It was in fuller bloom now. Several open flowers, the deep red they'd been working toward since June, climbing slightly toward the fence the way Sarah had said it would. He looked at it too. "I think eventually I do," she said quietly. Not to him specifically. More like she was placing something on record with herself. "Okay," he said. It was, he thought, the right answer for now. And right now was all either of them was actually navigating. The hard day arrived in late July without announcement, the way hard days did. He'd been fine when he woke up, fine through the school run. It was summer now, so no actual school, but he took Mason to his day camp at 8 and the drive was unremarkable. Fine through the first 2 hours of work. And then his project manager forwarded him a photo someone had sent in. An old photo of the downtown building they were assessing, taken in the mid-90s, the previous owners outside it for some kind of opening day. And in the background of the photograph was a restaurant that no longer existed, a small Thai place on the corner that he and Sarah had gone to on their 3rd date. He could not have told you the last time he'd thought of that restaurant. He could not have told you why a photograph of a building's background detail in a project file broke something open in him that morning that had been sealed for long enough that he'd stopped expecting it to break. Grief, he had learned over 4 years, was not linear and was not logical and had a specific kind of cruelty in its timing. He sat at his desk for a long time staring at the photograph. He got through the day. He picked up Mason from camp. He made dinner. Pasta again, the reliable pasta, the one Mason had specifically requested. And they ate, and he helped with the project Mason had brought home from camp, something involving building a small bridge out of popsicle sticks. And he got Mason to bed on time and read 2 chapters of the space book and turned the light out. Then he went downstairs and sat on the back porch in the dark and didn't do anything. He wasn't crying. He wasn't falling apart in any dramatic sense. He was just heavy. The particular heaviness of a grief day. The ones where the absence was not a concept but a physical weight, and the question, how is it possible that she is simply not here, felt fully unanswerable in a way it usually didn't. He sat there for a while. His phone lit up on the table beside him. A text from Victoria. Still up? He looked at the message for a moment. Yeah, he typed back. A pause. Then, back porch. He looked at the dark yard. The rosebush was a shadow in the low light, the red flowers black in the absence of illumination. Yeah. He heard her back gate. She'd started using it sometimes. The informal entrance, the neighbor entrance. And she came across the yard in a t-shirt and jeans and sat in the other chair without saying anything and without looking at him in that careful way that some people looked when they expected you to start explaining yourself. She just sat. He didn't say anything for a while. She didn't either. Grief day, he said finally. I know, she said. I could tell from your text this afternoon. I didn't text you this afternoon. Exactly. He looked at her. She was looking at the yard, her knees pulled up slightly, arms wrapped around them. She looked like someone who had learned how to sit with hard things. He supposed she had. It was stupid, he said. A photograph and a project file. In the background of the photograph there was a place we used to go. He shook his head. You can't predict the triggers. That's the part that... You can't predict them, she agreed. 4 days after the funeral, I cried for 20 minutes because Marcus's brand of shampoo was still in the shower. She paused. It smells different when you understand it's the last bottle. He let out a breath that had been sitting somewhere compressed since that afternoon. I keep thinking I should be further along, he said. 4 years isn't very long. People say a lot of things about grief. Most of them are things they've read rather than things they've felt. Her voice was even, not harsh. 4 years is nothing. You're raising a child alone. You're functioning at a high level professionally. She stopped herself. You're doing fine. I don't feel fine today. That's different from not being fine. He sat with that. It was the distinction his therapist had tried to make, in different words, and he'd understood it intellectually for years without it landing the way it landed coming from her. From someone who was not trying to make him feel better as a professional function, but simply telling him what she actually thought. Do you have them still? He asked. Grief days. Yes, less frequently. They hit differently now. Not less hard, just, She searched for it. More contained, like the impact radius is smaller even if the center is the same. That's a good way to put it. I've been trying to articulate it for 3 years. She almost smiled. Nice to know it finally made sense to someone. They sat in the dark for a while longer. At some point she got up and went into his kitchen. She did this now, had developed the comfort of his kitchen in a way that he found he didn't mind, found he actively liked, and came back with 2 glasses of water. She put one beside him and sat back down. Thank you, he said, for the water and for coming over and for not asking him to be okay. You'd do the same, she said. And the thing was, he would. He was realizing that about them, the reciprocity of it. He showed up when she needed it too. The funding round had closed in early July, and the night after it closed, when it should have been celebration, she'd texted him at 9:30 that she was too wired to sleep, and he'd walked over and they'd sat on her porch for an hour while she decompressed with the particular kind of tension that doesn't know how to release even when the outcome was good. He'd listened and occasionally said the right thing, and mostly just been there, which he was learning was often the thing. He didn't leave early that night, on the grief night. They stayed on the back porch until past 11 and talked about things that had nothing to do with grief. A book she was reading, the popsicle stick bridge Mason was building, a structural problem Ethan had been turning over at work. And he felt the heaviness not disappear but distribute, become something shared rather than something carried alone. When she left through the back gate, she paused with her hand on the latch. Hey, she said. He looked at her. She was loved, Victoria said. That's still true. It doesn't go anywhere. He had no response to that. He just nodded. She went through the gate, and he heard it close and sat in the dark a little longer, and then went to bed and slept without the usual resistance. August arrived, and with it the heat that made the neighborhood feel thick and slow. Mason's camp ended in the first week, and Ethan took 4 days off work. A rare thing. He was not a person who took time off easily, had spent 3 years filling every gap with work as a matter of survival strategy, and the 4 days were just the two of them. They drove to the lake one afternoon, not Cedar Lake, but another one, smaller and less scenic, the kind of place people went because it was 40 minutes away and had a decent swimming area and a concession stand that made adequate hot dogs. Mason was not a natural swimmer and was deeply resistant to this characterization, which led to an extended negotiation in the parking lot about whether he needed to wear the flotation vest. Ethan held firm. Mason wore the vest and spent 45 minutes in the water demonstrating with considerable energy that he did not need it, while Ethan sat on the bank and watched and was aware that this was one of those ordinary afternoons that had no reason to stand out except that he was present for it in a way he hadn't always been. He texted Victoria a photo of Mason attempting to prove the necessity of his vest by floating horizontally with his arms out. She sent back 3 laughing emojis and then, "He's going to be insufferable when he learns to swim properly." He smiled at his phone and put it back in his pocket. On the 3rd day off, he drove Mason to his mother's for the afternoon because his mother had requested the time, and Mason had agreed with the enthusiasm of someone who knew there would be particular foods at his grandmother's that did not appear at home. Ethan drove back to the empty house and cleaned it, which was something he did when he didn't know what to do with himself, and then sat in the cleaned house and found it very quiet. He walked to Victoria's. She answered the door in work clothes. She often worked on her laptop from home on Fridays, still conducting business from the kitchen table, and looked at him with mild surprise. "I have the afternoon," he said. "Mason's at my mom's. I have a call at 3. What time is it now?" She checked her phone. 1:15. "Then you have an hour and 45 minutes. She looked at him for a moment and then stepped back to let him in. Her house was, he'd been inside before, but always briefly, always the kitchen or the porch. He looked at it now with the attention of someone who'd been wanting to and hadn't. It was the same floor plan as his, mirrored. The layouts of the houses on this street were all variations on the same structure. But it looked different from his in the way that spaces take on the character of the people who inhabit them. Her bookshelves were organized in a way that suggested she'd started with a system and then adapted it over time. There were plants, real ones, healthy, not like his rosebush's relationship with benign neglect, but actual intentional plants. A framed photograph on the wall that he looked at and then looked away from, not wanting to stare. A man and a woman at some outdoor event. The man dark-haired and laughing. The woman clearly Victoria, younger, looking at the camera with an expression he recognized as hers, but without the particular layer that 3 years of widowhood had placed there. He didn't say anything about the photograph. She didn't explain it. They sat at her kitchen table and she made coffee. Good coffee. She'd upgraded too, he noticed. And they talked about nothing in particular. The funding round's aftermath, what Mason had said at the lake about wanting to learn to sail, whether Ethan's mother had ever actually stopped worrying about him or just became better at hiding it. "Neither," Ethan said. "She's exactly as worried. She's just decided it's not productive to express it constantly. That's love in a practical form. That's my mother in a practical form." She smiled and he watched it happen, and he was aware, had been aware for weeks, becoming more aware by the day, that he was in the middle of something that he could not control the outcome of. That was the honest truth. He had no idea where this was going. He didn't know what Victoria needed or what she was ready for, or whether what was building between them was going to be strong enough to hold both of their histories. He didn't know if he was ready, whatever ready meant. He'd stopped being sure he knew what ready meant. What he knew was sitting in front of him, her hands around her coffee cup, the photograph on the wall, the healthy plants, the adapted bookshelf system, the 3 o'clock call she had to take. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Okay. I don't know how to do this at the right pace. I'm not..." He chose words carefully because he meant them, and words that were meant deserved care. "I'm not a person who's good at gradual. I think in structures. I want to understand the load-bearing walls before I know what the building is." "But you can't," she said. "But I can't. Not with this." "No," she agreed. "You can't. He looked at her. I'm not saying I want to rush anything. I'm saying I'm aware that I'm in it, that this is already something for me. And I didn't want to keep having dinners and Saturday mornings without saying that honestly. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking, not stalling, actually thinking, giving it the consideration she gave things. I'm in it too, she said, carefully. Ethan, I need you to understand that I'm slower than you. Not because I'm less. She stopped. Not because it's less. I'm just slower. I have been slower about everything since Marcus. I think before I move. I probably overthink. I know. And there are things I'm still figuring out. I know that too. The kid questioned, she said, direct, because she was always direct. I meant what I said. I don't know. That's a real uncertainty for me, not a deflection. I heard you. And Mason, she paused. I care about that kid. That's already true, and it is what it is. But I know what that means, and I know the weight of it, and I don't want to. She looked for it. I don't want to be something that comes and goes for him. I won't be that. Something in him steadied at that. The particular steadiness of hearing someone say the thing you most needed to hear in the exact right way. He won't let you go anyway, Ethan said. You know that. He's already decided. That's what I mean. That's why I have to be careful. Okay, he said. Okay. Okay. We're careful. We're honest. We move at the pace things need to move. He held her gaze. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment with something in her expression that was more unguarded than he'd seen it. Neither am I, she said. Her 3 o'clock call happened at the kitchen table, and he read her copy of a magazine he'd never read before in the living room while she conducted it. And when it ended, she came to the doorway and said the call had gone better than expected, and he looked up and said he was glad, and then he stayed for dinner. Not planned, just he was there, and she made something with pasta and vegetables, and they ate at her kitchen table, and the evening came in through the windows. He helped clean up, and somewhere around 8 o'clock she was washing a pan, and he was drying it, and she said, without looking at him, "This is the most domestic thing I've done since Marcus." He looked at the side of her face. Is that okay? I'm deciding, she said. She finished washing the pan. He dried it. She put it away. Yes, she said. It's okay. He left around 9. At her door, she did something she hadn't done before. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, her fingers around his forearm, the slightest pressure, and then gone. Not nothing. He walked 3 houses home in the August night and went inside and stood in the kitchen where Sarah had planted a rose bush outside that had finally bloomed, and he felt the weight of everything that had brought him here. All the hard years, all the managed mornings, all the grief days and the school runs and the times he'd sat in the dark listening to Mason breathe. And underneath all of it, something else. Not certainty. He still didn't have certainty, but something had been rearranging itself in him, slowly and without announcement, and he recognized it now the way you recognize weather when you've lived in a place long enough. Not the end of the storm, just the quality of the light changing, the possibility, real and alive, of what came after. He stood in his kitchen for a while, then he texted her. The pan dried fine, for the record. She responded in under a minute. I didn't doubt you. And then, good night, Brooks. He put the phone down and went to check on Mason. Asleep, the solar system turning slowly in the draft. Pluto where it had always been, still out there regardless of what anyone decided to call it. And then he went to bed. August outside, warm and full. The rose bush in the dark, doing what it had always done. Still there. September came in like something that had made a decision. The heat broke in the first week. Not gradually, not the slow surrender that sometimes happened at summer's end, but overnight, the way seasons sometimes simply conclude. Ethan woke on a Tuesday morning to find the air had changed, carrying that particular coolness that smelled like the beginning of something rather than the end, and Mason, who had opinions about weather, came downstairs and announced that fall was his favorite season with the conviction of someone delivering a verdict. You say that about every season, Ethan said. Because every season is my favorite when it starts. That's not how favorites work. Yes, it is, Mason said, and poured his cereal, and that was the end of the conversation. School started the following Monday. The third grade, a new teacher, a classroom Mason had already inspected during orientation with the systematic attention he brought to new environments. His backpack was packed the night before. His shoes were by the door. Ethan stood in the kitchen at 7:15, watching his son eat breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone who had a schedule to keep and thought, 4 years ago, getting this kid through mornings had felt like an act of daily excavation, pulling both of them out from under the weight of a house that had become too quiet. Now Mason packed his own bag. Now Mason set his shoes by the door. He didn't do it without being asked because he was a perfect child. He wasn't. He forgot things and argued about bedtime and had once, memorably, attempted to negotiate his vegetable consumption in a written document with supporting citations. He did it because somewhere in the past 4 years, he had become a kid who understood that life had weight and you carried your part of it. Ethan drove him to school and walked him in, and Mason turned at the classroom door with the particular composure of someone who had decided to be okay about something. "It's going to be fine," Mason said. Ethan looked at his son. "I know it is." "I was saying it to you," Mason said, and went inside. Ethan stood in the hallway of Millbrook Elementary and felt the specific combination of pride and helplessness that seemed to be the primary emotional texture of fatherhood, and then he went to work. Things between him and Victoria had continued to move at the pace they moved. Not slow, not fast, but honest. The Friday dinners had become a consistent fixture. Saturday mornings were theirs without anyone having declared them so. He had keys to her back gate now, not because it was symbolic, but because the latch had been sticking, and he'd fixed it one afternoon while she was on a call, and afterward she'd handed him the spare key with the practicality of someone solving a logistical problem. He kept it on his keyring anyway. The practicality of it didn't change what it was. She'd had a hard week in late August. A senior engineer had resigned unexpectedly, taking institutional knowledge and 2 ongoing projects, and the week after had been the kind of professional crisis that required her to be completely present in a way that left nothing over. He'd brought food over twice that week without being asked. Not elaborate food, once a container of the pasta he made well, once a pizza because by Thursday neither of them had the energy for anything that required a pot. He'd left them on her porch and texted when he did, and she'd texted back in the late evenings with updates that were partly professional debrief and partly just reaching out. On the Friday of that week, she'd knocked on his back door at 9:30 at night and said, "I just need to sit somewhere that isn't my house for an hour." "Come in," he said. She sat at his kitchen table and didn't talk for the first 20 minutes. He made tea. She'd once mentioned she switched to tea when she was too tired for wine and too wired for nothing, and sat across from her and let her be quiet. Mason was asleep upstairs. The house was the particular nighttime quiet it got when the day had been used up, and what remained was the residue of everything that had happened in it. "The engineer thing is fixable," she said eventually. "It's going to cost me 3 months, and I'll have to restructure 2 teams, but it's fixable." "I know," he said. "I'm not talking about the engineer." He looked at her. She had her hands around the tea mug, always both hands, always that, and she was looking at the table. "I had a moment today where I thought, Marcus would have known what to do. He'd been through a restructure. He would have had a specific practical answer." She paused, and I sat with that for 10 minutes, and then I realized I do know what to do. I've been running this company for 6 years, and I know what to do. And the moment I realized that, I felt, she stopped, guilty, like knowing what to do without him was some kind of betrayal. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I know that one," he said. "Yeah." The first time I felt genuinely okay. Not performing okay, actually okay. I spent a week being angry at myself for it. He turned his own mug on the table. Like getting better was an insult to what we'd had. "It isn't," she said. And then, almost with surprise, "I know it isn't." "Yeah," he said, "but knowing it and believing it happen at different times." She looked at him across the table and he looked back, and it was there between them. The understanding, the full, uncomplicated, hard-won understanding of people who had been through the same kind of fire and come out the other side still smoking around the edges. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not the brief contact at the door from August. This was deliberate. She reached, she placed her hand, she left it. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while in his kitchen at 9:30 on a Friday night, and it was not a dramatic moment, and it was not a romantic movie moment, and nothing resolved or concluded. But something was said, in the language of two people who had learned that sometimes the most important things happen not in declarations, but in small, sustained acts of choosing to stay. She went home around 11. At the door, she looked at him with an expression that was open in a way she was still learning to let herself be. "Thank you," she said. "The tea was nothing." "Not for the tea." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. September continued. Mason adjusted to third grade with the purposeful stoicism of someone who had decided to take it seriously, which meant that by the second week he had already identified the most interesting kid in the class, a girl named Priya who apparently knew more about marine biology than any 9-year-old had a right to, and begun what his teacher would later describe in a progress report as a highly focused academic friendship, which was accurate and also extremely Mason. Ethan found Priya's presence in the school pickup orbit one afternoon and introduced himself, and Priya's mother, a physician named Anita, recently divorced, entirely self-possessed, gave him the careful assessment that parents gave each other when their children had decided to be friends and the parents had to figure out whether to become acquaintances. They exchanged numbers for carpool logistics, and that was the extent of it, but Mason mentioned Priya daily for the next 3 weeks, which was its own kind of evidence. "She thinks the bioluminescence section of my spacebook is the wrong kind of science," Mason reported one evening. "She sounds right," Ethan said. "It was a gift," Mason said. "Good books are good books regardless of category." Mason considered this. "She says the ocean is more interesting than space because we know less about it." "What do you think?" "I think they're both interesting for the same reason." He paused. "The unknown part is the interesting part." Ethan looked at his son over the kitchen table. 8 years old, going on 45. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." The moment that changed things arrived in early October, and it arrived, appropriately, through Mason. He had a cold for 4 days. Not serious, just the standard fall misery of a kid in a school building. And Victoria came over on the second day with soup, the real kind, from scratch. The same recipe she'd made in August. She knocked on the back door and Ethan opened it, and she was standing there with a container and her coat half buttoned, and she said, "I made too much. It's soup. Here." She would have handed it over and left, but Mason appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas and called down, "Victoria?" She looked up at him. He looked like he'd been in bed for 2 days, which he had, his hair going in several directions and his face carrying the pale, slightly aggrieved expression of a sick child who has been horizontal too long. "Hey, kid," she said. "Can you come up?" "Mason," Ethan said, "I just want to show her the new part of the spacebook. It won't take long." "You're sick." "I'm in my room. She can stand in the doorway." Victoria looked at Ethan. He looked at her. She handed him the soup container and took off her coat. She stood in the doorway of Mason's room for 25 minutes. From the kitchen, Ethan could hear them. Mason explaining something about stellar formation, Victoria asking questions that were real questions, not the kind adults ask children to be polite, but the kind you asked because you actually wanted to know. He heard Mason laugh twice. The second time it was the full laugh, the loud one that he had from his mother, the unself-conscious one. Ethan stood in his kitchen and held the soup container and felt something move through him like a current. When she came back downstairs, she found him at the kitchen table. She sat down across from him. She looked something. He watched her face and couldn't quite name what it was until she looked up at him and he recognized it. She was working something out. Something had shifted in there, and she was figuring out what it meant, and she was being honest with herself about it in real time. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I've been careful," she said. "You know that. I've been—" She seemed to pull something up from somewhere it had been sitting. When Marcus died, the thing that lasted the longest wasn't the sadness. It was the closing down. I closed everything that wasn't essential. I ran the company and I functioned and I was fine, and I didn't let anything in that wasn't strictly necessary because necessary things were manageable and the other things were She stopped. The other things were where it could go wrong. I know, he said. I know you know. She looked at him. I'm not careful about you anymore. That's what I'm telling you. He held her gaze. His heart was doing something that he hadn't been fully prepared for, which he supposed was appropriate. Okay, he said. I'm not saying I'm not scared. I'm not either. I'm not saying it's easy. I know it isn't. I'm saying... She looked briefly like she was going to qualify it again, layer another caveat over it, and then she stopped and let it be what it was. I'm saying I'm not careful anymore. He reached across the table. She took his hand. Okay, he said again. You keep saying okay. Because it is. From upstairs. Dad, can I have water? He didn't move immediately. Neither did she. They sat for one more moment at the kitchen table with their hands linked, and the October evening coming through the windows, and the sound of a sick kid in a room full of space books, and a solar system mobile that had been turning since before he could remember. And he thought, this is a thing that is real. Not a plan, not a structure with a blueprint. A real thing, alive and imperfect and requiring tending, like a rose bush planted by someone who is no longer here, but whose presence in the yard is still felt every time the flowers come back. Dad! He squeezed her hand once and let go and got up to get his kid water. November. Victoria met his mother officially in November, on a Sunday lunch that Ethan had suggested with the knowledge that his mother had been constructing an elaborate patience for months and it was beginning to cost her. They ate at his house. Ethan cooked, something he was better at than he gave himself credit for, a whole roasted chicken because it was the least fussy option for an occasion that needed to not feel like an occasion. And his mother arrived with a pie and looked at Victoria with the careful, warm attention of a woman who had been worrying about her son for 4 years and was now, cautiously, beginning to revise her expectations upward. The lunch was not perfect. His mother asked one question about the company that accidentally revealed she'd been researching it online, which created a brief moment of transparent mortification on her part and tactful generosity on Victoria's. Mason knocked his juice over in the first 10 minutes, and the cleanup became its own small event. Victoria's phone went off twice during the meal. She silenced it both times without checking it, which Ethan noticed, and which said something about what she was choosing to prioritize. By the end of the afternoon, his mother and Victoria were in the kitchen discussing rose varieties while Ethan and Mason did the dishes. And Mason was drying a plate with the careful thoroughness he applied to household tasks, and his mother said something that made Victoria laugh. The real laugh. The unguarded one, and Ethan heard it from the kitchen and thought, that sound is going to be in this house now, regularly. That laugh is going to be a sound his house knows. He dried the pot and said nothing about it. Some things you didn't put into words because words weren't adequate to them, and this was one of those. His mother left at 4. She hugged Ethan at the door and said quietly, just to him, she's good. 2 words. His mother had said more important things to him in his life, but not many more important than that. I know, he said. You deserve it. She pulled back and looked at his face. Both of you do. He walked her to her car and stood in the driveway and watched her go, and then stood there a moment more in the November air, which had lost the pretense of warmth and was being honest about what was coming. That was the thing about November, he thought. It didn't lie. The trees were doing what trees did, letting go of what they couldn't hold through winter, not dying, just releasing. And the neighborhood had the bare, clean look of a place preparing to endure. He'd always found it slightly melancholy, November. He found it less so this year. Victoria and Mason were in the backyard when he came back through the house. She had her coat on, and he had his. And they were standing near the rose bush, which had finished blooming and was doing what roses did in the fall. Not dramatic, not gone, just pulled back. Mason was explaining to her the projected height of the canes if they let it climb the fence the way Sarah had intended. Victoria was listening. He stood at the back door and watched them without interrupting. He thought about a conversation he'd had with Dr. Reeves the previous month, the sporadically scheduled therapist who occasionally pointed things out to Ethan that Ethan had been avoiding. He described the situation, Victoria, the dinners, the Saturday mornings, the kitchen table moments, with the careful language he used for things he wasn't sure how to frame. And Dr. Reeves had listened in his slightly sardonic way and then said, "You're describing someone you love." Ethan had not answered immediately. "The language you use about Mason," Dr. Reeves said, "same quality of attention." "That's different." "The quality of attention isn't different. What's different is what you're allowing yourself to call it." He'd sat with that for 3 weeks. He was still sitting with it, standing at his back door watching his son explain rosebush growth trajectories to a woman who had walked 3 houses down a street one morning in a dark blue sweatshirt and had not, in all the ways that mattered, left. He pushed the back door open. They both looked up. "Mom says the canes need to be tied to the fence before it gets cold," Mason said. "Otherwise they break." "I know," Ethan said. "We'll do it this weekend." "Victoria said she'd help." "I said I could help," Victoria clarified. "If you want an extra set of hands." He looked at her in the backyard, her coat, the November light on her face, the rose bush behind her. He thought about what Dr. Reeves had said. He thought about a wedding he'd almost skipped and a reception lawn and a woman turning under string lights. He thought about the porch light 3 houses down and better coffee and the sound of a gate that didn't stick anymore. He thought about his son reaching across an armrest during wedding vows and a drawing on a kitchen table and a sick kid calling down the stairs. He thought about the quality of attention. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." The hard conversation happened 2 weeks later, because it had to. He'd been carrying the shape of it for a while, the thing that needed saying that he hadn't said because there hadn't been a right time. And then there had been right times that he'd let pass because he was still, in certain ways, a person who preferred the structure of knowing to the risk of not. But November was almost gone, and the year was running out, and he'd spent enough of his life managing from a distance. He knew what he wanted. He was 32 years old, and he knew what he wanted, and the least he could do was say so. They were on his back porch on a Saturday. Cold now, properly cold, the kind of November that required coats even at noon. Victoria had a blanket over her knees that had appeared at some point from inside his house, a piece of domestic migration that he hadn't tracked. Mason was at his grandmother's for the morning. The backyard looked different without the flowers. Plainer, more structural, the bones of the thing visible now that the seasonal softness had gone. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She looked at him over her coffee. "Okay. I'm not going to be subtle about it." "You're rarely subtle," she said, with the slight warmth that lived at the edge of most of what she said to him now. "I want this to be a real thing," he said. "Not a careful thing, not a what are we thing, a real thing." He looked at her directly. "I'm in love with you. I think I have been for a while, and I've been—" He almost qualified it, almost hedged, and stopped himself. "I love you. And I know that's a large thing to put on a porch in November, and I know we both have histories and complications and things that aren't resolved, but I'd rather say it plainly than keep managing the distance." She was very still. He waited. The backyard was quiet. Somewhere down the street a car started. The rosebush canes were tied to the fence now, the way Sarah had always intended, waiting out the winter. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I mean," she took a breath. "I've known. For a while. I've been waiting for you to say it because I needed to hear it from you, in words, before I—" She stopped. Something in her expression was trying to stay composed and not fully succeeding, which was its own kind of thing to see, because Victoria's composure was usually substantial. "I love you too. I've been—" She made a small sound that was almost a laugh and not quite. "I've been conducting myself with you for months in a way that makes that completely obvious and telling myself it was manageable. And it was, and it is, but I—" She looked at him. "Yes, that's the answer. Yes." He crossed the 2 feet of porch between them, and she stood up from the chair to meet him, and when he put his arms around her, she held on in a way that told him everything the composure had been holding back, the whole careful architecture of it, the months of approach and retreat and honest conversation, and he felt her breathe, one long exhale, like something finally set down. He held on too. They stood on the back porch in November and held on, and neither of them said anything for a while. There wasn't anything to say that improved on what was already there. Eventually, she pulled back and looked at his face with wet eyes that she was not pretending weren't there, which was new, which meant something. "This is terrifying," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is. I'm going to be difficult. I know. I work too much and I overthink, and I will absolutely start a conference call at the wrong moment on at least one important occasion. I forget to mow the lawn for 7 months, and I cook the same 5 meals on rotation, and I have a kid who will ask you difficult questions without warning. I know your kid. I like your questions. His questions." She caught the slip and something moved across her face. "I like him. You know that." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and put her hand against his face, briefly, real, and then dropped it and turned to look at the backyard, the tied canes, the plain November bones of everything. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. They sat back down and finished their coffee. Later he would think about that, how they'd sat back down and finished their coffee, and find it was the part of the memory he held most carefully. Not the declaration, not the held breath before the answer. The sitting back down. The ordinary life waiting on the other side of the moment. Mason came home at noon with leftover pie from his grandmother and the specific bright energy of a kid who'd been well-fed and well-loved all morning and had not apparently stopped talking for 3 hours. He came through the front door and found them in the kitchen, Ethan making lunch, Victoria at the table with her laptop open. She'd pulled it out after the coffee, after the work call she'd taken standing at the fence, and had been half working in the way she did sometimes now when she was in his house and had things that needed attention. And Mason put the pie on the counter and looked between them. "Nothing's different," he said. It was not a question. Ethan and Victoria looked at each other. "Something's different," Ethan said. Mason studied them. Then he studied the pie. Then he got a fork. "Okay," he said, with the complete equanimity of someone who had been conducting himself as though this outcome was already settled. "That's it?" Ethan said. "Okay. What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something." Mason ate a piece of pie directly from the container, which Ethan normally would have addressed, and looked at Victoria. "Are you going to move in?" "Mason," Ethan said, "it's a reasonable logistical question. It's—" Ethan stopped, looked at Victoria. She was looking at Mason with an expression that was mostly amusement and a certain amount of genuine thought. "Not yet," she said. "But maybe someday." "Okay," Mason said, and got a plate for the rest of his pie, and that was that. Ethan stood at the stove and thought, this is my life. This specific, imperfect, complicated, profoundly not smooth life. The kid eating pie at noon on a Saturday while the woman he loved worked at the kitchen table, and outside the window the rosebush waited out the winter. He made sandwiches. He put them on the table. Mason ate his in 7 minutes and announced he had a book report outlined to work on and disappeared. And Ethan and Victoria ate their lunch and talked about the rest of the day. Nothing major, some errands he needed to run, a call she had at 3, whether they should walk to the park later before it got dark too early, the way it did now. And it was ordinary, completely ordinary, in all the ways that ordinary had once felt like a ceiling and now felt like the whole point. He had not gotten here by fixing himself. He needed to understand that, had needed to understand it for 4 years, and was only now, sitting at a kitchen table in November, fully landing on it. He hadn't waited until the grief was gone, because grief didn't go. It became part of the structure, a load-bearing thing you learned to build around. He hadn't waited until he was ready, because you didn't get ready from a distance. You got ready by actually moving, by letting the real thing be real, and seeing what you were made of. He was imperfect. He was still the man who avoided lawns and worked through lunch and sometimes sat in the dark of his son's room for too long. He still had grief days that arrived without warning and rearranged everything temporarily. He still thought in structures when he should have thought in feelings, and he still reached for control when he should have reached for trust. He was also a man who had shown up. At a wedding he didn't want to attend, in a neighborhood where his porch light and her porch light faced the same street, at a kitchen table where someone reached across it first, and he turned his hand over. All the times he had shown up even when every careful instinct said, stay still, manage the distance, protect the things you can still protect. He had shown up anyway. That, he thought, was the only lesson worth keeping. Not that life rewarded the deserving. He knew too well that wasn't true, had watched people who deserved everything get nothing and still get up in the morning. Not that love was simple, or healing was linear, or that the right person made the damage go away. Just this, that you could still choose to move. That moving forward wasn't a betrayal of what you'd lost. It was the thing the people you'd lost would have wanted, the truest thing, and you owed it to them and to yourself to believe that. You showed up. You turned your hand over. You let the real thing be real. Victoria looked up from her laptop at some point and found him watching her and raised an eyebrow. What? Nothing, he said. Just thinking. About? He thought about how to say it. About how I almost didn't go to a wedding. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at her laptop, but he saw it. The corner of her mouth, the small, real, kept thing. Lucky for you, she said. I did. He smiled and looked at the window, at the November yard, at the rosebush canes tied to the fence where they'd been tied to survive the winter, growing in the direction Sarah had always said they would. Still there, still growing. That was enough. That was, in the end, all of it. The lonely man who had almost stayed home finished his sandwich and looked at his life and found that it had become, without his fully noticing, something worth looking at. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, not without weight, but alive. Finally, fully, irreversibly alive.